Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Coast Talks virtual speaker series. My name is Sophie Silkes, and I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement here at Coast. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to acknowledge I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. I'm calling in from the Coast Ocean Innovation Hub on Herald Street here in downtown Victoria, British Columbia. And for those who are new to Coast, we are the Center for Ocean Applied Sustainable Technologies and an initiative of the South Island Prosperity Partnership. We are Pacific Canada's hub for the sustainable blue economy. So our mission is to attract top talent, capital, and strategic partnerships to British Columbia's ocean sector to propel innovation and growth. At the core of our offerings is Coast membership, which is the most direct way to connect to the Coast community and benefit from our program streams. It's designed to support companies within the blue economy in BC and looking to come to BC at every venture stage. It's also for individuals and students, nonprofits, government finance, and other organizations that serve as vital partners within this sector. Coast membership opens the door to different offerings like subsidized workspace, meeting and event space here at the Ocean Hub, tickets to mixers, access to all of our digital portals and communities, new courses and workforce development offerings through our member program, Blue Pathways, and much more. You can learn all you'd like about Coast after the webinar at canadacoast.ca. I will move on to today's topic, which is about regional insights for the blue economy. And I'm so delighted to be joined by some really illustrious panelists and look forward to introducing them and then asking them to share more about themselves in just a minute. But first, setting some context about the blue economy. It's expanding rapidly worldwide, and regional ecosystems, as we know, vary substantially within their needs, their challenges, and opportunities. So we're here today with representation from different ocean hubs across North America and also globally to talk about how those needs differ, where they intersect, and how special opportunities like engaging deeply in ESG and the impact sector can make itself known within those different places. We'll discuss some trends around barriers and opportunities for continued growth and find out what we can all do together to propel forward this incredible sector. So I'll move into some introductions of our panelists. We'll start today with Ann Carpenter, the CEO of Braid Theory and managing partner at Innofuse Blue. Welcome, Ann. Would you take a few minutes to introduce yourself and share just a bit about your background, then we'll move to Basma.
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking an hour to spend it with us. So Ann Carpenter, as she mentioned, CEO of Braid Theory and managing partner of Innofuse Blue. Both of these organizations are entrepreneur-serving organizations focused on supporting engineering and science-led startups in the blue economy. Braid Theory was started by myself and a couple of co-founders about 8 years ago, and in this past year, I've bought out my third co-founder, so I'm sole owner. But my background came through, Innofuse Blue was formed in November of last year. And our latest endeavor is we just launched Braid Theory in Barcelona, Spain. So we truly are working on being a global organization. My background is actually quite varied, as so many in the blue economy space. I started my career as a programmer in the aerospace industry. Had a great opportunity to do M&A work and also an internship or an entrepreneurship program within the Lockheed Corporation. So basically spinning out tech that had been developed for the defense industry that had commercial application. I took a left turn or right turn or something and started a design, marketing, and market strategy company, which led me back into the tech space, ultimately working with a nonprofit incubator focused around ports and the shipping sector. Somewhere along the way, I lived on a sailboat, scuba dived in French Polynesia and just became really intensely enamored, and even was telling Sophie almost moved to Salt Spring Island to live a life of a kayaker. But you know, the ocean and solutions around the ocean are critically important to me personally, and it's just been a great ride to blend my personal pathways and professional. So that's me.
Thanks, Anne. I think we all have gone through a phase of wanting to move to Salt Spring Island. So you're in great company here. I will pass on to Dr. Basma Majerbi. If you would take a minute to introduce yourself and share a bit about your background, that'd be great.
Thank you, Sophie. My background is not as adventurous as Anne's, which is very exciting. So first of all, I actually just landed a while ago in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabes, Chippewa, and many others. So I would like to acknowledge that. So my background, I did actually grow up by the Mediterranean Sea in Tunisia, so I have a very close connection with with not the ocean but the sea. And then I studied in Montreal for my graduate studies, and Victoria called me probably because of the ocean, because something was missing in the East Coast, and I've been living and working in Victoria since 2004. So I'm a professor of finance at Gustafson Business School. And recently, my research focuses on a variety of topics, and I'm really very passionate about sustainability. Fellow of the Center for Social and Sustainable Innovation, and also the Institute of Integrated Energy Systems. Disciplines, which is very enriching experience. And a few years ago, I started thinking about, you know, I went into kind of like a startup mode myself, and founded the Impact Investing Hub at University of Victoria, which officially launched in 2023. It's a research and education hub at the intersection of climate action and impact investing. And you know, our goal is to collaborate to mobilize finance for positive impact, and excuse me, my computer is a little bit, do you still hear me?
We hear you just fine.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I had some notification. So some of the projects that are connected to ocean a little bit that I'm working on is I'm collaborating on in University of Victoria through the hub is, for example, a graduate training program, which is called the Coastal Climate Solutions Leaders. It's a 6-year program where we're training graduate students to become climate solution leaders. And it's focused on climate solution relevant to people in coastal urban centers and rural communities, as well as coastal ecosystems. So ocean expertise and climate research. The ocean climate connection is a very important area at UVic. We have tremendous expertise. And so we're leveraging this to train graduate students. And the other big initiative at University of Victoria that I'm involved with is called Accelerating Community Energy Transformation, or ACET initiative, whose mission is to bring Canada closer to a net zero future by supporting local place-based clean energy transitions. And some of the strategic research in this area, in this initiative, have to do with low carbon offshore renewable energy technologies. So my role on this project is to bring in the business and finance, and how do we actually mobilize investments towards these type of solutions. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Basma. You can see we have enough expertise here for a week of webinars, so we'll see what we can get to in an hour. I'll stop the screen share so we can just have a conversation. Thanks for letting me know about the chat. Should be fixed. Let us know where you're calling in from. I'd love to start by first diving in to a little discussion of the regions that we're all working in. I know, Anne, you've got some really great history collaborating with Canada. And Basma, you were just sharing, even within Canada, your work that crosses over into the rural versus urban areas, looking at energy needs in those different places. So maybe we'll start with Anne, if that's all right, but I'd love to hear more about the regions that you're most involved with. You mentioned Portugal is a new one, and maybe some of the trends that you're seeing related to the blue economy.
Sure. So yes, I definitely want to acknowledge that we've been working with Canada's been our partner since day one of our company. So we've been very, very proud of that. And working, as I mentioned with you, privately, that a lot of the work we're doing with it was with Atlantic Canada. So we're super excited to see more and more opportunities to collaborate with Coast, with us being also on the West Coast. So Braid Theory, so the facility actually, I need to do a new picture because there's a lot of activity going, but I just like this photo. But this is our where we land in Los Angeles, which is at a facility called Alta Sea at the Port of LA. And we strategically put the company there, which is right in the heart of the industrial area of the San Pedro Bay Port Complex. So, other parts of LA are much more focused on tech, on media, on entertainment, on biotech, and there's strong, thriving entrepreneur ecosystems there. But we wanted to position Braid Theory in the heart of where the industry is, because part of the goal of what we do with Braid Theory is to bring the entrepreneurs to market, not just look at them around for VC funding and so on. So the ecosystem around ports, not only here in LA and Long Beach, but globally, is super interesting. Basma, you were talking about this kind of coastal ocean, urban, as well as rural, but in our case, more urban. But this connection of the coastal areas, and especially where ports are, is really, really important to us, and how the ecosystems we work with. So if you're going to be working, for example, with startups that have a solution for ports, it's more likely that they might grow by going to Singapore or Rotterdam or Montreal rather than going up and down to the local next city to us or whatever. So right from the start, we thought of that we needed to have a more global focus, even though we are strongly anchored here in Southern California. So locally, our area, as I mentioned, is heavily around decarbonization of shipping and goods movement, efficiencies in supply chain, cold chain, solutions that can support the other industry sectors like food and fashion and biotech. And we're seeing some really interesting opportunities for entrepreneurs, not from the market, but from the technology that might be developed around synthetic biology, that is developed maybe for some solutions closer related to human health, but it has an ocean climate opportunity. So that makes this a really rich ecosystem for us to work in. But we saw, of course, and then the regulatory environment is something we always look at as how that drives opportunities for entrepreneurs. Because especially when you're looking around sustainability, resiliency, climate-focused solutions, if the ocean is your customer, it's not always easy to find that business model. And so sometimes you're often looking at a regulatory environment that's requiring companies to do the right thing that create the opportunities. So then when you start looking through that lens, that leads us into, for example, our work in Europe with Portugal and soon to be Barcelona. And there, again, there's different regulatory framework related to single-use plastics, related to carbon credits, related to decarbonization of shipping. Well, there's IMO regulations, global regulations, but all of this is important to us to look at the landscape to see where and how to help shape market pathways for our startups. And then most recently, and I'll stop here, is we've been very privileged to start a relationship with Pier 71 and MPA Singapore, working with supporting like the Smart Ports Challenge, which and that is very strategically important to us because around the world you're starting to see these green and digital shipping corridors between regions, which creates a great opportunity then for entrepreneurs to bring solutions around the world and across the oceans. So.
Thank you, Anne. I actually have a question before I move over to Basma. I'm curious about how transferable what you learn in each location is. You're speaking a lot about regulation, which I think comes up for all of us. How transferable is the knowledge and the set around regulations in one geog to the next?
Well, I think it's very transferable because a lot of it is just related to timing.
Mm-hmm.
So in some cases, what's really happening, why we're looking at these, first mover nations or regulatory environment is then that can be the market entry, the opportunity for pilot projects, but it doesn't mean that you would only bring a solution for there and not somewhere else. But sometimes it's just, with the entrepreneurs, you've got to be very agile and you're looking for path of least resistance to get them to the market.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Basma, we're speaking about regulations. I know you're in Toronto for some specific business that may or may not pertain to that. I'd love if you share a little bit of the framing that you're bringing to this conversation around ESG and impact, maybe at a high level, and then tell us a little bit, if you will, just about some of the trends that you're seeing around impact. We were talking about the startup sphere as well as investor trends. But if you wouldn't mind just starting us off with that intro and sharing a bit with what you're seeing regionally and even across Canada, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Before we get to the regulation, I think I just want to highlight that globally, investments in the, for example, when we talk about impact investing, typically investors want to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to measure, not to measure, but to at least set impact goals, right? So because they want to invest not only for financial returns, but also to pursue measurable positive impact. And SDG 14, which is life below water, is the most underfunded SDGs among all of them. So this is really significant, and there's been a number of reports that highlighted that, and some conferences and some initiative trying to attract attention. I'll give you some numbers. Some of the recent reports suggested that we need 175 billion per year is needed to achieve SDG 14 by 2030. But between 2015 and 2019, just below 10 billion was actually invested, and that's according to a World Economic Forum report in 2022. So there is a huge gap, which is kind of like if you consider the importance of the oceans in the global economy in terms of all the local livelihoods. I mean, you can see a lot of numbers and how many millions really depend on oceans for their food, work, in addition to the potential climate adaptation and mitigation through the oceans, of course, definitely there is a big gap here, right? So, we're lacking investment, and we need more investments in ocean and marine sector. when it comes to innovation, I think, and the startup world and so on, I think Canada is one of, there's a lot of like innovation. Canada is one of the global leaders, particularly in the climate space. And I see big connections between climate and ocean. Technologies like, wave energy, offshore wind, carbon capture and storage using ocean basalt or other opportunities like even people at University of Victoria are exploring. There are tremendous opportunities for innovation in the ocean and marine space, and definitely more attention should go to funding. A lot of these companies struggle attracting capital at the growth stage. There's very good government funding at the very early stages, and some angel investors and VC funds focused on impact. But then at the scale-up stage, usually they struggle to attract funding, maybe compared to other countries. And I'll be curious to see what Anne has observed.
Yeah. So you just have so many good points to make. If it's okay, I'll just jump in here because I know you have a lot of content.
I will get to regulation later. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, let's take one step at a time because there's so much good content that you put. First of all, you're absolutely right around the funding for the SDGs and the lack of that. Certainly I was at the UN Oceans Conference. There's the next one coming up in 2025 in France. I'll be there. We participate in these things and are acutely aware of that. I think your point you made about ocean and climate being interconnected is one of the pieces that we can use to help solve that puzzle a little bit, is to recognize that investors who are talking about climate investments are likely already in some way touching or intersecting with the ocean. Those that are doing investments in food and food technologies, you can't look at any journal anywhere without talking about aquaculture and kelp and seaweed and futures in that. So some of it is just sort of recognizing, hey, investors, there's no need to be afraid of this space because you're already tangentially getting into the space. If you're doing AI work and predictive analytics and predictive modeling, why would you not look at some of these big climate models and opportunities and dire needs, as we're seeing in Florida right now, for better models to do weather predictions, for example. So, there's some things that we try to do to try to bring more investors who don't think they're in the space, how they actually could be in the space. I think that's one thing that we can keep looking at. I think you're right about some of the funding, although now the name escapes me, but I just heard on a LinkedIn another new fund for growth stage in blue economy, and I won't take the time now, but folks like Propeller, there's been more, there's definitely a lot more VC funds and, sort of growth stage funds that are available now than I saw just even a few years ago. We're members of a group called the 1,000 Ocean Startups, which is made up of about 50 organizations now around the world that are either entrepreneurs serving organizations like us, incubators, accelerators, clusters, or investors. And to your point on impact, we have our own Ocean Impact Navigator. So we're collecting a lot of that impact data related to the entrepreneurs along with their economic and financial data. So to show that these things go hand in hand and aren't mutually exclusive. Okay, so I'll stop there. But also Canada, I think one big difference, having worked with many Canadian companies, some right now in the wave energy space, for example, is there's a very big difference that Canada puts a lot of funding in the very earliest of stages, like you mentioned, but then there's also different kinds of ongoing funding, whether it's with matching funds like the Ocean Supercluster funds or projects through Transport Canada. And there seems to be, we don't see the same, I'll call it aggressive approach to getting external funding by Canadian companies as we see have in the US companies. You definitely have a mindset in the US that right away you're going to be looking for how are you going to attract capital? How are you going to get that seed funding, that angel investment, the pitching, and so on, where the Canadian companies, and again, I don't want to make overgeneralizations, but we see them taking that. There's more voucher programs, there's more resources available, which then creates a really great ecosystem of startups. But then when they hit that next step, sometimes they're not as dialed into the investment community, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Just yeah, that makes total sense. And just going back to Sophie's questions on regulation, I think there's been an acceleration of regulation around ESG disclosure. So what is ESG? So those of you who are not familiar with the term, I'll define that. But the reason I mentioned this, it's because this represents huge opportunities for startups in the ocean and marine sector. So ESG refers to environmental, social, and governance factors that basically that affect business activity. Okay, so these ESG criteria, typically, a lot of people think about them as affecting large corporations, right? But they are also very, very important for small and medium-sized companies, especially in the sector of the blue economy. And when we talk about ESG, typically we talk about ESG risks and opportunities. And I'll give you some examples on the risk side, for instance. For instance, if we talk about marine pollution, right? So that risks and that's maybe subject to some regulations and so on. Biodiversity loss is another one that is huge now, and investors are looking at biodiversity. It's becoming like the new climate now. There's new frameworks being developed for companies to and investors to basically invest in respect with reverse the biodiversity loss. And so SMEs that are involved in the fishing, marine development, that can impact, marine biodiversity. So that's a risk factor for them. Also, when that biodiversity loss, it can also affect revenue sources for these companies. Climate change, of course, with the rising sea level levels and ocean temperature that is impacting marine industries, represents a big risk for companies, large and small. And so, these when companies are now going back to the regulation, so these are examples of risk, and there are of course a lot of opportunities related to environmental, social, and governance. What I mentioned here is just examples of environmental factors, but the reason I mentioned regulation is that, just to give you one example, in Europe, I was reading recently with the enactment of the new corporate sustainability disclosure regulation. Over 40,000 companies will be mandated starting from this year. Actually, they have to report next year on their performance in 2024. And so these companies are required now by law to in Europe to disclose detailed data on how their business activity is affected by and affects some of these environmental factors that I mentioned, whether biodiversity is one big one, and including biodiversity in oceans as well as in land, climate, pollution, and resource use, and all that. So what that means, and by the way, this applies not only to companies that are based in Europe, but companies that operate also with interact with other European large companies. So these companies that are required by law to disclose like a tremendous amount of data, and there are frameworks. It's now into law. The metrics are well defined. They have to provide assurance as well, and so what that means is that they will also, have to do it across the supply chain when they collect those data, which means like all the smaller companies that are in their supply chains will feel the pressure, even if they're not required by law to actually disclose that type of information. So it represents a little bit of risk for smaller companies that are not ready to collect and share this type of information with their clients, and so basically that's the risk factor. On the other hand, it also creates tremendous opportunities for innovation, right? Like, for example, companies that are developing software for tracking data on marine pollution, or on biodiversity loss, and providing solutions in ocean and marine sector. They can position themselves as providing solutions, whether it's on data analytics, or offering carbon capture solutions, or use of lower resources, or protection of marine ecosystems. These are all great opportunities that will be more and more in demand. And I think like with any changes in regulation, of course there are those companies that will fall behind, but it also creates tremendous opportunities for new business, new business opportunities for other companies who are well positioned into that. So that's on the ESG space. Of course, there's also the Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted and signed by over 200 companies in Montreal in late 2022. And that also requires companies and multinationals to provide detailed information around their impact on oceans, right? So one of the targets is to protect, 30% by 2030 in biodiversity loss in oceans and other natural ecosystems. So again,
oh, you're cutting out now, Basma.
Yeah, I think I think my internet is cutting, sorry. So
well, maybe I can, maybe I can jump in here now. Maybe this is a good place, because as you describe it, this is one of the things that we do with Braid Theory, and what we work with our clients and the companies that are going through our accelerators and other programs, is to really think through that process of not just the regulatory environment, not just the sort of the stick side of it, but what kinds of needs, what kinds of opportunities bubble up because that exists, right? And for those traditional SMEs that might be in the space, can they use this as a way of not only just doing the bare bones of compliance, but change and evolve their business strategy to embrace the new regulatory environment that can give them a competitive advantage? So, for example, I can give you a case of a company that we're working with that's a Spanish company, Barcelona based. We are working with them in California. It's called Ocean Ecostructures. And it's basically panels that are from a calcium carbonate base that can attach to existing infrastructures, whether they're piers or offshore oil platforms or so on. And there's a whole system and an approach, a technology, they call them the life boosting units, to actually regenerate that biodiversity loss that is often the case from the more industrial environments that they're in, but also can even be seeded to bring back near extinct species because of a global warming, that maybe you can position these units further in cooler waters, for example. But there is an opportunity then, for example, in offshore wind or oil platforms, refineries, etc., to not just do the regulatory reporting, but to actively use their structures to improve that environment. So we're seeing, and this is just one example, there's a number of companies that are in this related space, and this company, along with others, when you're starting to then calculate and measure, because of course you can't change what you can't measure, anything that you're doing that is, looking at using AI to recognize species of fish and marine life that's coming around there, using that to calculate biomass. So you can actually put quantification to your biodiversity goals. And then, as in some cases, I think entrepreneurs even have the opportunity to help shape and inform what that regulatory environment looks like. Because when you are the best available technology, right, you're looking sometimes writing regulations before the technology is there. And sometimes when you're doing that, then there's all these backing away because the tech isn't available yet. But on the other hand, sometimes when you're seeing what the tech can do, that then really can help shape that framework. And so we definitely encourage our startups to participate in those policy discussions.
I have a question. I'm curious to.
And I would add,
go ahead, Basma. I'll give you a sec to catch up. We can hear you pretty much perfectly. Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to add to a point that Anne said here, because she highlighted the tremendous business opportunity, right? Like competitiveness, access to new markets, and so on. I would add also access new financing, right? Because a lot of these companies that are offering solutions will be really like sought after by investors as well, because they also are following the shift in the regulatory environment, and they can see the new market opportunities, and they can see the early, stage companies that are developing solutions that have tremendous business opportunities as well, right? And so access to new financing, ESG focused investors, impact investors, would love to see, companies like that are at the forefront, not only on the, they can understand the impact story of this company or the ESG related performance. It fits with their, portfolio ESG lens, but also the financial return aspect that the opportunity will present, right, in a changing environment.
I know that for Coast, just putting on my Coast participant hat for a minute, we were talking, Anne, and you're just mentioning this too, Basma, just about investor education and also demystifying kind of the ocean investment space and ocean startups, making that proactive connection to clean tech and climate tech, and explaining, even as you're saying, food systems, it's kind of ocean is omnipresent. It's a part of all of those different portfolios. I know for us, it's a priority to help kind of start and really flesh out those conversations with investors to make it, to de-risk the concept, right, of starting to play within the ocean space. And we have an event next week where we have batches of startups at different level, whether earlier stage or scale up phase, but communicating with investors who in some cases have no idea or think they don't know what's going on in ocean and why it's worth investing in. Although most of these investors live here in Victoria, where they're surrounded by it all the time and confronting it. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And I'm curious to build on this discussion. As you mentioned, I love and agree with you, you can't change what you can't measure. Anne and I was just speaking with Joshua at Maritime Blue about 1,000 Ocean Startups, and I think you referenced that. Is it the Navigator? What is the
Yeah, that's the platform that all of us as 1,000 Ocean Startup members, as we bring forth working towards those 1,000 ocean startups that we support, then there's a voluntary reporting through this Navigator platform as part of 1,000 Ocean Startups.
Yeah, I'm curious to talk a little bit about frameworks and how you're seeing startups that you work with like try to undertake this process of measuring impact, whether it's something that you're seeing is kind of baked in, they're kind of already interested in tracking it. And Basma, from your perspective, ESG, is that something that's we're at a point where it's just a given, or do we have a bit of a ways to go in terms of encouraging startups to even consider it, let alone measure it? And I'm sure it's different in the spheres that you play in. So I'm curious to hear a bit from both of you on this.
Yeah. So first and foremost, you can't have impact if you don't have a sustainable and scalable business model. So first and foremost, we've got to, it's our job at Braid Theory and working with our entrepreneurs to really hone in finding business models that work. And sometimes it's just, you have to think harder. You have to come up with doing business models. If the ocean is your customer, you have to think about, well, what does that look like? As I said before, how does that shift? Sometimes it's looking at what is the risk if these solutions are not implemented, like nature-based solutions and coastal resiliency. And then you go back, or I don't know, an E. coli, if you have an early warning detection in beaches, and it costs X amount of dollars versus the billions of dollars if a beach in Waikiki has to be shut down because of an E. coli outbreak. So then that triggers entirely new different business models to think about how you position your solution. So that's number one. Then the other part about it is to really think of, when it comes to impact, is, well, for some of the work we do, right, with decarbonization of shipping, there's very clear frameworks. Like in California, there's a for certain California funding, there's a Carl Moyer program that has an actual calculation that you have to go through for, in this case, not on the GHG, but for diesel particulate matter and SOx and NOx and, different pollutants, air pollutants. So there's some impact measurements that, or biodiversity, you can calculate biomass, you can count fish, right? So there are some very tangible ways, but then there's also sort of those less tangible, but that's no different than what we look at like in a company valuation. When you're looking at valuing a company, there's the hard assets, but there's also the brand, the value of the brand. Well, if you think about impact as like brand value as well, and that is subjective, but it doesn't mean you stay away from it, or that you think of it as being less valuable than the pieces of the cost of the equipment. So Basma, love to hear your thoughts.
No, I totally agree. I think impact is really hard to measure, right? It's multidimensional. Sometimes it's not tangible, but also sometimes impact occurs over time. You can just see the impact immediately, right? And so, whether you look short term or long term, that's different, However, there are a lot of resources, and I think there's no shortage of framework for measuring impact in all sorts of industries. The challenge, of course, is that, you have multiple frameworks, so that can be very confusing. And specifically for startups and SMEs, it's a capacity issue, right? Like, how do you actually dedicate resources to measure and track and communicate that impact? So that's one problem. And the other problem is, in the investment world, we tend to use, well-established global frameworks, okay, in terms of impact measurement and management, and those exist. And even though I said they are confusing, but there has been over the past few years tremendous effort for harmonization, both in measuring impact as well as other ESG metrics. And I make a difference between ESG and impact, they're kind of, like impact is basically your revenue generating activities, how impactful they are, and ESG is more like G as part of good management, good business management, good strategy and governance, and having good relation with your employees and so on. So it's intrinsically related to your to the value of the firm, right? So to the business drivers of the firm, and so there is. I think SMEs require support, and we've seen this happen in other countries, like Singapore, for example, putting tremendous resources to support SMEs in being ESG ready and build capacity and be future ready for all these changes of regulation. We're lucky in British Columbia, we have the ESG Center of Excellence that is developing resources to support SMEs also. And so we at the University of Victoria and the Impact Investing Hub, we started also a training program to support SMEs in understanding in their impact, as well as their risks, as we mentioned, right? How they are affected in this understanding ESG risks and opportunity. And I want to highlight a few things from the ecosystem survey that Sophie mentioned earlier. We will publish the detailed results, but I don't have the results in front of me, but what I remember is that interestingly, more than maybe close to 90% of the companies surveyed who we asked the question, do you anticipate raising capital in the next 2 years? And those who answered yes, the overwhelming majority of them said that they are targeting impact investors. So if you're targeting impact investor, the first thing you need to have is your impact metrics, because otherwise, it's like, how do me as an investor, how do I compare two companies, right? Even if they are operating in the same space, which one is, and they have similar kind of like financial return, risk return profiles, which one is more impactful, right? So that becomes part of the decision analysis. So having good metrics about the impact is very important. Now, back to the survey, the ocean and marine companies in our survey, we asked the question, we gave them a list of ESG issues, which one they thought are the most important and which ones are the most difficult to measure. And the top two are carbon emissions and biodiversity. So those were actually the top two, and both are environmental issues. So they find them very difficult to measure, and with carbon it's not just your scope 1 and scope 2, it's also like scope 3 emissions gets into supply chain and a little bit more complicated. And as you mentioned, Anne, with biodiversity and so on, the metrics exist, but it's not necessarily well known. It requires a bit of support to identify the ones that are aligned with the company perspective. And I think it's important that also companies don't operate in a disconnect with their stakeholders. So if their stakeholders are looking at them from, referring to certain frameworks, it's better to use the same, so you speak the same language, right? Because they're looking for those alignment, for that type of alignment with their frameworks. And so I've seen a lot of investors when, companies are pitching, or even like institutional investor where other VC funds, for example, are pitching to institutional investors. They want, and I'm on the board of some organizations, we want to know the impact measurement framework. We want to see some examples of metrics. We want to, we really do a lot of due diligence on the impact in addition to the financial return. But what that means is that these VC funds will be actually seeking those data from their companies as well, right? So it's an investment chain. So whatever is determined in the big players world, it will trickle down to the smaller ones, both on the investment community level as well as at the corporate level.
Yeah, and that's so true, everything you're saying about how things are trickling down, because I think that's, so from the startup side, you made some great points that early on, the entrepreneurs really are unable to truly measure the impact. It's a moving target as their solutions are evolving. There's not enough data because there's not enough of their systems out in the marketplace. These things take time. And so, I mean, I think one of the things that I appreciate about that Impact Navigator is to getting the earliest of stage companies to start thinking about it as they're looking at, if they're going to state that they're going, like you said, after impact investment, then they have to start putting things in that lens and being as specific as they can and how measurable they can. The other thing on the other side, from the corporates, one other hat that I wear is I serve on a board of a group called the Smart Freight Center based headquartered in Amsterdam, but initiatives around the world. But there it's really about there was developed the Global Logistics Emissions Framework, the GLEC framework with industry that has now been the basis of the ISO standard that was announced not in the last, year and a half or so. And this is, if you will think about, is the recipe or the framework for multinational corporations to calculate their emissions across multiple modes of transportation. And then it allows for exactly what you said, that consistency of process and approach to it as they look for, if it's a Unilever, all the different brands under the Unilever and all the different products and all the different components and so on and so forth. So you start going all the way through. So when, Unilever says they're going to reduce, GHG emissions by X billion of whatever's, then there's got to be that trickle down of the framework implemented through all of their suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. Gets complex.
Yeah, that's a tremendous accomplishment. And if you have a link to those, to the standards, that would be great just to share. I know we're winding down to our last few minutes here all together. So I just want to create an opportunity for some last comments. And I'm thinking particularly from Coast perspective, I know that a lot of the participants in this call and who will watch this after the fact are ocean startups at various stages who are probably trying to, if they're listening, think about how to integrate this into their business plans. And I love what you said, Ann, about the first step to, creating some sustainability is having a sustainable business. So I'm wondering if you have advice, whether it's resources that come to mind. It could be for investors, it could be for startups. How should they begin this journey of really thinking about where can they look for ESG advice, for education? This is the lead up to a plug for Basma, who I think has something to share about a Blue ESG course, perhaps, that's being offered. But I'd love to hear from both of you about just initial pathways forward that startups might take in this direction.
Yeah, I on resources, Sophie, I put a link to a database of, it's non-exhaustive, but it's already very, very long, of ESG impact standards, frameworks, and other tools. It has a visual, but it also explains each one and what it does, and you can filter by theme or by usage, right? Is it for disclosure? Is it for impact investors? Which ones are used by impact investors, for example, and so on. And on the education side, it is definitely a big gap. The talent gap is huge in the ESG space, and universities are trying to contribute to filling the gap through our regular programming with training and so on. But also ESG and impact fundamentals for SMEs is an 8-week training to focus that the next offering is going to be focused specifically on ocean and marine sectors. So that's why it's called Blue ESG. And, you know, the companies, we're accepting application right now through Coast. So Blue Pathway is offering scholarships. So it will virtually cost nothing for the companies, and they will benefit from hearing from professionals. It's very applied. There are a lot of exercises where they go step by step about their companies to do a deep dive on environmental factor, social factor, governance, impact. We also, you know, something we didn't talk about here, you know, in the ocean and marine sector, there's like a tremendous opportunity of collaboration with indigenous communities who are, you know, stewards of a lot of like a coast, and there's a lot of innovation and knowledge to be shared. There's also, you know, so we're going to talk about that as well, and there is advisory one-on-one.
Thank you, Basma. Anne,
My
any
internet is
final words
Well,
moving forward?
yeah, sort of the last words of wisdom. Well, first of all, I joined. Part of the reason why I love participating in panels is I learned so much as well. So I already, you know, while you were saying those last words, I made sure that I copied that standards list, because that will be a tremendous resource for our clients, the companies we work with. But then I'd also say for those of the startups that are in the audience, if you're thinking about joining accelerators, incubators, clusters, is consider those of us that are members in the Thousand Ocean Startups, because we're starting from a point where we are committing to making sure that we're working with companies that that have positive impact on the planet. And so part of our job is to help shape what that messaging and what resources are available to do it. And it's not just Braid Theory. There's you know, organizations all around the world, and we're growing as well. So.
That's terrific, Anne. Thank you so much to Basma, to Anne for taking this time with us today. As you know, I would love to keep going all month. I'd love to have a follow-up and pull in some more of our regional partners. I'll echo Basma's plug for applying to the supremely subsidized Blue ESG course that Coast is working on offering through the University of Victoria, and having Basma as your instructor. I see one of your students in the chat. Would be a privilege. But thank you for being with us. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. We really appreciate it, and hope that you have a great rest of your day, and we'll speak to you all soon.
Thank you so much. And if anybody can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Ann Carpenter. I'm happy to try to answer questions if something didn't get covered, or if I mentioned something that you need a follow-up on.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah,
all right.
I'm going to put, I'll put a link also on the details about who are interested.
Perfect. I'll send a little email to the participants so everyone's got it. So thank you once again, Basma. Have a great trip in Toronto, and we'll connect soon.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.